In the 1980s, Mr. Gaffney served in the Reagan administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy. Prior to his work in the Department of Defense, he was a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He received a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and a master's in international studies from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Mr. Gaffney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One small addendum. I also had the privilege of serving in this body for Senator Scoop Jackson, who many of you had a long and wonderful memory, I'm sure. I appreciate the chance to testify on this issue. I recognize that I am in the distinct minority on this panel, but I take comfort from the fact that I think I represent the vast majority of Americans, and certainly the vast majority of those of you in Congress on this question. Should Gitmo be closed? And I think the answer is resoundingly no, unless there is a better alternative available to us. I'd like to describe why I think there is not a better alternative available by putting this into context, if I may. And that is to describe why we have Gitmo in the first place. It is because we are at war. This is a point that is seemingly lost on a lot of us who talk about this in sort of an abstract concept that somehow this detention facility can be removed from that overarching problem. We're not just at war. We're at war because others attacked us. And in your wisdom, you here in the Congress gave the authority to fight back. I'm afraid that increasingly, however, we've lost sight as to who it is we are fighting with. And again, I think that bears directly on the question before you all today. We are fighting, I would suggest, against people who adhere to a doctrine they call Sharia. Not all Muslims do, but those that are engaged at this point in,
Please, no outburst of approbation or disapprobation. Thank you.
Those that do adhere to this doctrine believe it is their obligation to destroy us, to force us to submit to their will. That bears directly upon this question of what happens if they are allowed to return to the battlefield. And I think we all agree, recidivism among those who are released from Gitmo is a problem. Perhaps, as you said yourself, I think, Mr. Chairman, it's not as bad as recidivism in the federal prison system. That's a sobering thought, which again, I would argue, suggests we don't want to put these prisoners into the federal prison system if it's even worse than it is at Gitmo. The main point, though, is if the commitment these prisoners have, should they be allowed out, is to wage this jihad, as they call it, against us until we submit. It adds urgency to the question that Senator Cruz asked, which is, how do you prevent that from happening? And I would, with the greatest of respect, say, I find unconvincing the idea that any of these problems are made more tractable by simply moving these people into the United States. For one thing, it does raise a question as to whether the costs that we're paying, and several of you have alluded to this excessive, wasteful, inefficient cost, but how much has it meant that not a single one of these people or any of their friends have been able to attack us because of their proximity to a federal detention facility inside the United States? How many Americans' lives have been spared as a result? There's no way to know for sure. But are you feeling lucky? Do you want to take a chance? My guess is you will find much more violence inside the federal prison system, not least because these individuals will be engaged in proselytizing their form of Islam, Sharia, inside the prison system. But beyond that, you will have almost certainly their colleagues trying to do what was done in Iraq yesterday by Al-Qaeda, which is to try to spring them, or at the least inflict harm on an American community that has the misfortune, perhaps the Thompson Correctional Facility community, as an example, has the misfortune of incarcerating these people. My concern is that let's just set aside the numbers that you might or might not feel you can safely push out. There are a number, an unknown number, but the president has apparently said it's 46, that you can never try. Do you honestly think that the people behind me and the people who are impelling this hearing will stop cavilling for the release of those prisoners just because they're now in the United States? And finally, I would just say to you, you know better than I, federal judges inside this country will almost certainly look, at least some of them, with sympathy on the claim that these prisoners, once they're inside the United States, once they're entitled to all kinds of constitutional rights they might not otherwise have in places like Gitmo, that would perhaps result in their release inside the United States. I find that beyond malfeasance were we to go down that road. It is dereliction of duty. I pray you will not close Gitmo, and I hope that my testimony will encourage you not to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Gaffney. Our next witness is Lieutenant Josh Friday. Lieutenant Friday is a member of the Judge